Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed, this exploration into oligopoly, looking at the collusive models, looking at the non-collusive models, and looking at the kinked demand curve, looking at the nature of cartels, prisoner's dilemma, and game theory. I hope you learned a lot. Now we're going to go on to the market for resources, so labor, capital, and other inputs. Thank you very much. So in this module, we'll be talking about the neoclassical models for labor, capital, and natural resources. And we'll be analyzing wage differentials, why some people get paid more than others. We'll also look at the role of labor unions in facilitating higher salaries for their members through collective bargaining. We'll be looking at why a valuation of stock is derived from inputs and outputs. We'll look at the present value of a stream of earnings, and then alternative frameworks for analyzing natural resource markets. We'll be finishing this module with looking at Coase theorem and how externalities can be sort of settled or solved by private sector intervention as opposed to government, or at least that's what the Coase theorem postulates. And we'll also be looking at the different types of financial capital markets. Favor is better than labor. The neoclassical approach to labor is very black and white, like all neoclassical approaches in economics. The neoclassical approach tells us that firms exist solely to maximize profits. And workers also have one single goal as well, and that's the goal of earning money so they can buy stuff and increase their pleasure. And nobody has any motives besides those two in the labor markets. In our study of labor, we kind of hone in on the activities of people in the production process. And in the neoclassical perspective, that's the exchange of labor for wages. There's a lot of unpaid labor that goes on, housework, childcare, but for the analysis in economics, looking at the neoclassical perspective, this isn't included because there's no formal market for these. Self-employment is also excluded. The neoclassical model of labor views the market as based on supply and demand, but it does need some simplifying assumptions to work. The first simplifying assumption is that on the demand side, it assumes that all firms are forced by the competition to maximize profits and minimize costs. And on the supply side, it assumes that workers have absolutely no intrinsic motivations for work aside from making money. Now, we know that that isn't true, or isn't true. Subsequent research has proved that that isn't always true. We see people get a lot of their sense of meaning and sense of identity from their work. But for the neoclassical perspective, it's very black and white. Firms are about profits and workers are about utility. So what affects a firm's desire or decision to hire? As far as a firm gets additional revenue than it has to pay out in wages, then it should continue to hire. That's called the profit maximizing decision rule for labor. It says that hiring should continue till the marginal revenue product of labor is equal to the marginal factor cost of labor. There's also opportunity costs to employment. So when you're employed, you can't do, when you're working, actually actively working, you can't do leisure activities. You also have the opportunity cost of self-employment. You're also not in active education usually, although people can work and learn, but you're not in full-time education if you're in full-time work. And also household production and work around the home is not being done either. The labor supply curve for any industry is upward sloping. That means as wages rise, other workers enter the industry and are attracted by the incentive of higher rewards. So they may have moved from other industries or not have previously held a job. The extent to which a rise in the prevailing wage or salary in an occupation leads to the expansion of supply of labor depends on the elasticity of labor supply. So what are the factors affecting labor supply? Number one, the real wage on offer in the industry itself. The higher the wages, the more the increased factor of rewards that should boost the number of people willing and able to work. Opportunities like overtime also affect the supply of labor. The opportunities to boost earnings through the payments that come with overtime and productivity related pay schemes. Another thing is the availability of substitute occupations. The real wage on offer in competing jobs also affects the wage and the earnings differential that exists between two or more occupations. The barriers to entry also affect labor supply. Artificial limits to an industry's labor supply, say through minimum requirements, for instance, can restrict the labor supply and force pay levels higher. So things like legal profession, for instance, where you have to have a law degree, or medicine, where you have to have a degree in medicine and surgery, are very strict entry criteria. Also, improvements in occupational mobility of labor. So if there's increased training and education, then there'll be more people available with the skills to work in a particular profession. So those are the key factors that affect labor supply. Possibly the most famous graph in labor, when you were studying labor, is the backward bending labor supply curve. And that's because we experience, or the theory goes, the graph shows how in a work environment up to a certain level of income, people tend to want to work more and more and more. But when they get to the level of income that they have in their minds that they always wanted to earn, they start wanting to chill out a bit and, not work so hard. So a typical supply curve shows an increase in supply of labor as wages increase, and it slopes from left to right. However, in labor markets, we can often witness a backward bending supply curve. This means that at a certain point, higher wages can lead to a decline in labor supply. This occurs when higher wages encourage workers to work less and enjoy more leisure time. There are two effects to determining the supply of labor. Number one is called the substitution effect. The substitution effect states that a higher wage makes work more attractive than leisure. Therefore, in response to higher wages, supply increases because work gives greater remuneration. The income effect states that at a higher wage, workers can achieve a target income by working fewer hours. Therefore, if wages increase, it becomes easier to get through enough income through working fewer hours. So in the first section of the backward bending labor supply curve, the income effect is at work, and people work more and more and more because they can get more remuneration. But at a certain point, they think, I can't come and kill myself, let me enjoy my money. And then the income effect comes in, and they start working fewer and fewer hours because they've already gotten their target income. I decided to do all the graphs at once, so please forgive me, but this is the last actually set of graphs in the module, and a really important set of graphs at that. So we've spoken about in the previous two slides the supply of labor and the backward bending supply curve, and we're now going to talk about the demand for labor. So many factors influence how many people a business is willing to take on at any one time. But the obvious thing is the salary, right? It's how much they're going to get paid. And there's an inverse relationship between demand for labor and wage rate. So for businesses, the lower the salary, the more people they're going to take on. And if the wage rate is high, then it's more costly to take people on. So as you can see, um, the there's an inverse relationship according to the graph showing that higher wages result in contraction of demand. Lower wages result in expansion of demand. And what can cause the labor demand curve to shift? What causes changes in the way that firms demand labor? Number one, a rise in customer demand, which means businesses need to take on more workers. Number two, a change in the price of good or the service that labor is making. Number three, an increase in productivity of labor, which makes labor more cost efficient than the capital. Number four, an employment subsidy, which cuts costs and allows businesses to employ more workers. And number five, a change in the cost of capital equipment. Say robots, for instance, or AI, which makes it cheaper to use technology than it does to use humans. And what are the role of unions in all of this? I've put on this slide a picture of probably Nigeria's most famous union leader ever, Comrade Oshomole, and he became famous because he was a very effective negotiator when he led the unions negotiating for his workers, his members. And a union is a legally recognized organization that uses collective bargaining, that's the power of numbers, to bargain for their members. And the labor market situation under a union represents kind of what a monopoly does in selling a product. Well, in this case, it's a union. And it's a monopoly selling labor to firms. At the higher union wage, however, firms actually sometimes hire less labor than they would have hired if ordinary market forces were working. So some people say that unions actually disadvantage people in that not as many people get hired, and it creates a two-tier system between the union workers and the non-union workers. But what we know over the past 20 years is that union membership in general has really declined. It's become a lot less popular. People are doing freelance jobs. Their perspectives have kind of changed. So unions aren't actually as strong as they used to be. And plus, there's been a lot of private sector effort to discourage union membership because of that collective bargaining power. So that's really that about unions. We're going to finish by talking about the other types of factors of production: manufactured capital, natural capital, social capital, and financial capital. Um, Manufactured capital is quite unique because it's used over a period of time. So examples of that are buildings, plants, and equipment. And when you're trying to place a value on manufactured capital, you really need to take into consideration the future earnings that capital will generate. Natural capital, like land, water, minerals, are finite resources. And even though some people try to put natural capital under the sort of same category as manufactured capital, I think the point here is that natural capital is finite. Now, the Coase theorem that I spoke about earlier states that the most efficient solution to resolving interdependent uses of the environment, including pollution, is a bargaining process among the relevant property holders. So the Coase theorem believes that most of the problems around the use of natural capital, including pollution, can actually be solved by bargaining amongst the private sector and not having to necessarily bring in government. Social capital, of course, is the knowledge, ideas, value. It's more like intangible, it can't be seen, and it's more difficult to value. And then finance capital, we're all very familiar with: equity and debt. And finance capital isn't really a factor of production in itself, but it's a means of acquiring other factors of production, like land, labor,